Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Daf Yomi. We are back. It has been a good few weeks with all the Yamim Tovim that we've not been able to meet together, but it is wonderful to have you all here today. To all of you on Zoom, to all of you watching this on YouTube, we welcome you all. Please forgive the fact that I will be often squinting and coming close to my computer screen. My glass is disintegrated and I cannot see very well. But here we go. We're going to be doing Eruvin, page 77. And as always, that's always a red herring, because we're going to start from 76b with the Mishnah at the bottom of the page so that we can all kind of catch up a little bit to what we're talking about. So you should all be able to see it there on Zoom. And you should all be able to see it there on YouTube. And we are going to get underway. We're going to get underway now with the Mishnah on the bottom of 76b. We're in chapter 7 of Eruvin. We've only got a few more weeks of this. I think 5 or 6 I calculated. And then we are moving on from Masechet Eruvin. But let's... pardon me? No?
Thank goodness for that.
Yes, it is a bit of a difficult one, but you know what they say: if you make it through Eruvin, it's plain sailing for the rest of the 6.5 years or whatever we've got left. So here we go. The 7th chapter, the beginning was talking about when you have walls separating 2 courtyards, and then you either have a breach, or you have a window, or you have a hole of some kind, and whether the breach in the wall, whatever it may look like, would therefore create a situation where the residents of the 2 separate courtyards can nonetheless share an Eruv and create the ability to freely pass from one to the other. So yesterday's daf was a little bit mathematical, trying to figure out the areas of circles and all that kind of thing. Hopefully, today's daf should be a little bit more easygoing, especially if you're like me and not very good at the maths. So the Mishnah says as follows, towards the bottom of 76b, Ayin Vav Amud Beis, Kosel Shabain Beis Chatzeros. If you have a wall that is dividing 2 courtyards, Gavoha Asara V'Rochav Arba'a, and the wall is 10 tefachim high, and it is 4 tefachim wide. The thickness, as it were, of the wall is 4 tefachim. Why are these numbers significant? Because it would mean that the top surface of the wall between the 2 courtyards fits the dimensions to be considered as a separate domain. In which case, the Mishnah says, Ma'arvin shnayim ve'ein ma'arvin echad. Because this wall is of such a substantial size, it is separating the 2 courtyards completely. And that means the only solution for them is to treat their courtyards as completely separate, which means that each one is going to have to establish their own Eruv to be able to carry within their own courtyards. If you recall, a courtyard is going to have a few houses dotted around it. So an Eruv Chatzeros, a courtyard Eruv, is going to enable the residents of a courtyard to move freely and to carry freely amongst their own courtyard. Because this wall divides the 2 courtyards, they will have to operate as 2 completely different entities. Hayu Barosho Peiros, if on the top of this wall there were some fruits. You could call it, they've laid out a kiddush on top of the wall. What's the situation over there? Says the Mishnah, Eilu Olin Mikan V'Ochlin. So people from one side are able to go up and they're allowed to eat on the top of this wall. Ve'elu olin mikan va'ochlin. And the other side of the courtyard of the wall is allowed to go up and eat. As long as neither of them carry back down the items from on top of the wall. So it really is go up and grab and then come back down. So they're allowed to share, they'd be allowed to interact between each other and talk to each other and eat up there, because it's a separate domain. But they're not going to be allowed to take that those fruits or the whiskey or whatever you put up there. You won't be able to bring those back down. Says the Mishnah though, Nifrat Sakosa, if there is a breach in the wall, Ad Eser Amos, Ma'arvin Shnayim. If there is a breach in the wall, which is up to 10 Amos wide, then there's an option. They can treat it as two separate courtyards and have two Eruvin, V'im Ratzu Ma'arvin Echad. Or if they want to, they can join together and they can treat it as one courtyard, because now this breach in the wall turns that wall into, or turns the breach into an opening. However, Yoser Mikan, but if the breach in the wall is bigger than 10 amos, says the Mishnah, Ma'arvin Echad Ve'ein Ma'arvin Shnayim. If it is bigger than that, then they are now no longer considered as two separate courtyards. They have gone over the threshold of being considered two separate courtyards, and now their only option is to treat the courtyards as one entity, in which case they can only have one Eruv that functions for both sides of the courtyard. Hopefully that all makes sense. But now let's have a look at the Gemara right at the bottom there on 76b, which is going to lead us into 77. Here we go. The Gemara asks, Ein ba arba mai. What if the top surface, the thickness of the wall, is not 4 tefachim thick? Because at that point, then, it is not going to be considered its own space, its own domain up there. So what should the halacha be? Amar Rav. Rav said, Avir shtei rashiyos sholetes bo, lo yaziz bo afilu malei nima. So it's going to actually create a bit of a dilemma. Because what it's going to mean is, if it's not considered its own domain, then it's going to be under the jurisdiction, so to speak, of both domains. And since it's under the jurisdiction of both domains, what's going to happen is very interesting. It's going to be that they're not actually allowed to move anything, because what they are trying to move may actually be owned and controlled by the other side of the courtyard, and vice versa. So actually, according to Rav, what it does is create a situation where now nobody is allowed to do anything on the top of that wall because of the potential for it falling under the other courtyard's jurisdiction. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, turning now to the top of 77a, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Elu ma'alin mikan va'ochlin, ve'elu ma'alin mikan va'ochlin. Rabbi Yochanan has a slightly different approach. He says that it's not that you can necessarily handle anything at the top of the wall that's there, but what you are allowed to do is you are allowed to bring things up and eat it on top of your wall, and the other side similarly are allowed to bring things up and eat it on the top of the wall. So they're not supposed to be sharing things, they're not supposed to be utilizing anything that's up there already, but they are allowed to bring things up with them to the top of the wall, and they can eat them up there. And as we can see on the screen here, it's because the wall is considered non-existent, and so actually they are freely able to do that up there. It is a makom patur, and so we can act leniently. Says the Mishnah, Tanan, Elu olin mikan va'ochlin, va'elu ochlin mikan va'ochlin. So it quotes the Mishnah that you're allowed to go up and you're allowed to eat. Whichever side you're from, you're allowed to go up and you're allowed to eat the things that are up there. So we ask the question, based on these words, Olin in, Malin lo, I'm allowed to go up, but I'm not allowed to bring anything up. Is that the... Yes, the Mishnah Hachika Amar. This is what it's trying to say. Yesh bar ba'ala bar. If you have the wall space with a dimension of 4 by 4, olin in, malin lo, then you're allowed to go up, but you're not allowed to bring anything up. Ein bo arba alai bar. But if it does not reach the threshold of 4 by 4, then it's considered a makom patur, an exempt domain, and therefore malin nami. And therefore, by them bringing things up, they're not going to be violating any issue of transferring from one domain to another. Va'az the Rabbi Yochanan atayme, and this goes according to Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. This is consistent with his opinion. D'chi asa Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan, because when Rav Dimi came up from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, yes, he said that he quoted Rabbi Yochanan, Makom she'ein bo arba al arba, if you have a place such as this, which is, sticking up, and the surface of that, whatever it is not 4x4, then he would say, Mutar livnei reshus harabim v'livnei reshus hayachid lekasei falav. Then it would be permitted. So let's say you've got some kind of protrusion from the ground, which has a surface at the top of 4x4. Sorry, that does not have a surface of 4x4. Then Rabbi Yochanan would say that people coming in the public domain or people coming in the private domain would be allowed to rearrange their bundles on top of this surface, and there's not going to be any problems of transferring from domain to domain or carrying in a way that's not okay, because it has a status of a exempt domain. But he does provide a caveat, as long as they're not exchanging objects between them from one domain to the other domain. So if one is just readjusting their bags or whatever it is, then you're not going to be violating anything on a protrusion that has a surface of less than 4x4 tefachim. But now we ask the question, Rav leis leid Rav Dimi, does Rav not hold like this opinion of Rav Dimi? Why is that a problem? Because actually Rav Dimi is just really spelling out the implications of a Mishnah back in Masechet Shabbos. So if he's disagreeing with Rav Dimi, because if we recall, Rav said you're not allowed to move anything. That was what we said at the bottom of 76b. So Rav at the bottom of 76b had said you're not allowed to move anything on such a space. But that's now contradicting Rav Dimi, and all Rav Dimi is doing is referring back to a Mishnah. So how could Rav not hold like him? So the answer that we get is as follows. It says the Gemara, when we're talking about biblical domains and the implications of those biblical domains, then yeah, of course, Rav will agree with everything that Rav Dimi is saying. But what are we dealing over here? What are we dealing with over here? We're dealing with rabbinic inactions, domains that have a stricter implication because of rabbinic enactments. And there's a lovely concept over here. The Chachamim asu chizuk ledivreiha b'yoseh mishal Torah, and the Chachamim would reinforce their statements and would add additional enactments and stringencies in order to preserve the safeguards that they're trying to put in place, more so than something that was biblical, which is why you can have a situation where you can have something, a more stringent approach by Rav, even though Rav Dimi is having a more lenient approach, and that's because he's putting the additional safeguard around rabbinic enactments. Continues the Gemara. Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Nachman. Rabba said, quoting Rav Huna, quoting Rav Nachman, Kosel shebein shtei chatzeros, a wall that is separating two courtyards, Tzido echad gavoha asar tfachim, v'tzido echad shaveh la'aretz. So, what we're trying to imagine in our minds over here is that you have two courtyards, but they are on two different floor levels, two different elevations, and there's a wall between them, but the wall means that the higher courtyard has less visible wall than the lower courtyard. Is that making sense? Give me some thumbs up if that makes sense. So there's a wall between two courtyards, but because one courtyard is higher, so let's say in one courtyard there's only 2 tefachim visible or 4 tefachim visible, and on the lower courtyard they can see a full 10 tefachim because they have a lower floor level. So that's what we're trying to imagine in our heads at the moment. So who should get the functionality of this wall that is 10 handbreadths high on one side and almost level with the ground on the other side? Says the Gemara, So we give that top space of the wall to the side that is higher. Because for the guy living in the courtyard where there's very little distance to the top of the wall, it's going to be easy for him to use it. But for the guy who lives lower, so he's got to reach up. So the ability to use the space at the top of the wall is going to be easier for the higher courtyard. And anytime you have a situation where one side is going to find it easier to use than the other side, so we're always going to give the rights of usage to the side that's going to find it easier to use. Amar Rav Shizbi, Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Shizbi said in the name of Rav Nachman, Charetz shebein shtei chatzeros. If you have a ditch between two courtyards, do I need to scroll down? Can't see. Yes. A ditch that runs between two courtyards. Sido echad amuk asara, v'sido echad shave la'aretz. And again, you have two courtyards on differing elevations. So you're going to have one side where it's going to be a 10 tefachim drop, and you're going to have the other side where it's not. It's going to be a much lower drop. So what should we do? So the similar concept applies. We are going to give the use of the ditch to the side, to the courtyard, who would find it more convenient to use. But now the Gemara says, but we need to teach both of these teachings. We can't just say, well, the concept will apply to whichever way. And there's a reason for that. Because if we'd have only taught the example of the wall, then we would have potentially said, Mishum de vagovaha mishtamshe inshi. Because it is a raised structure, people are going to be prone to use it. But because the ditch, which is the depression in the ground, is going to be something that people don't really use. So therefore, you might say that it doesn't go to either of the courtyards. So So you might say that it shouldn't go to either of the courtyards. So that's why we need to teach the example of the ditch as well. If we'd have only taught the example of the charetz, then there's going to be an assumption or a presumption that it's going to be that is going to not be something that people are afraid to use because it's just a lower access. But because a wall is high up and people are going to be nervous that their things are going to fall down, so maybe they're not going to use it. So that is why that is why the Gemara brings both examples. That is why we needed two scenarios to be taught clearly so that we can understand what the halacha is supposed to be, because there's otherwise going to be a reason for us to think that one doesn't apply to the other. Says the Gemara. Are we all okay so far?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Continues the Gemara. Ba lema'ata. If a person now wants to be able to diminish the height of their wall, okay, so new scenario over here. Person wants to be able to diminish what is halachically considered the floor level and the wall level, which may have different kinds of implications. So they now want to be able to put things in place that could diminish the distance halachically between the floor and the top of the wall. Im yesh b'mi'uto arba mutar lehishtamesh b'kol hakosel kulo. If they are able to create the situation that the diminished section is on the top at least 4 tefachim wide, then they're going to have the use of that entire wall surface. But if they do not, then they're only going to be able to utilize the area that they have now created the halachic permissibility to be able to use. Says the Gemara, Manafshach. this should be pretty obvious to us. Whichever way you look at it, this is going to create an issue. I ahani miuta bekulei kosel lishtamish. If it helps to diminish the wall in whatever way you do, then you should be able to use the entire wall. It shouldn't matter what these sizes are. If the diminishment is helping, you should be able to use it. The iloma ahani afilu keneged hamiyat namila. And if it's not helping to lower the wall in some way, then you shouldn't be able to use the area that you have diminished. Amar Ravina, Ravina says, Kegon she'aka chulia mirosha. Ravina says, let's take, for example, a situation where you carve out, at the top of the wall, you carve out a space which is now considered to be diminished. That's what this situation is referring to. So if you're carving out, from the top layer of bricks, a space there which now becomes permissible to use, then if it's the requisite size, so now you can use the entire wall. And if it's not the requisite size, then you're only going to be able to use that specific area that you have carved out. Amar Rav Yechiel says, Kafar Safar Nemayet. Rav Yechiel says that if you overturn a basket on the floor of the ground, then that is now going to create less space between the floor and the wall. And if it is diminishing that height, then that's going to mean that you can use the top of the surface. Otherwise, it's too far out of reach. But now the Gemara is going to question this: Va'amai dava hanita b'shabbasu. Why should this be the case? Why should you be able to halachically consider this distance to be diminished? It's an item that can be moved on Shabbos. You're allowed to move a basket. The davar hanita b'Shabbos eino memayit, and anything that you're allowed to move should therefore not be able to be considered as diminishing the space from the ground to the top of the wall, because all he has to do is take away the basket, and then boom, you've now lost your reduced height. In which case, you now can't use the top of the wall. Lo, the Gemara answers no. Tzricha, this is necessary. The chavre ba'ara, it is fixed into the ground, and because it's fixed into the ground, it is now considered like your floor space, your ground level is raised up. However high the basket is, you've now created a reduction in space between that basket and the top of the wall. So the Gemara asks, "V'hi chavre ba'ara my have." What good is it going to do if you are attaching it into the ground? For Hatanya, we have a baraita that's going to create a problem for us. Paga shehitmina b'teven, if you have unripe fruit that is hidden in teven, that is hidden in straw, it's buried in straw. V'charara shehitmina b'kechalim, or you've got a cookie that is hidden in coals. In megula miktsasa nitalas b'Shabbos. If you can see even a little bit of it, then you're allowed to move it on Shabbos. In which case, what we're challenging over here is the fact that if something is in coals or if something is in straw, which you shouldn't be moving on Shabbos, there's a baraita that's teaching us that you're allowed to move things even if the prohibited things are going to be moved. So therefore, with our basket that is overturned on the floor and it's attached to the ground, then we've tried to say that the basket cannot be moved on Shabbos, because if it gets moved on Shabbos, if you try to detach it from the ground, you're going to be moving the soil, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. But then we've said, but hang on a minute, we've got other examples where things can be moved. In which case, a basket, even if it's attached to the ground, is something that can be moved on Shabbos. And if it can be moved on Shabbos, then why can it reduce the size between the ground and the wall? We've got these two other examples of things that can be moved, even though the things they're buried in are not allowed to be touched. So the same should apply to our basket. So the Gemara says, what are we dealing with over here in our Gemara? We're dealing with a basket that has a rim, and the rim is fully buried in the ground. And if you remove the basket which is overturned and it's in the ground and there's rims involved, it's going to dislodge the earth in a way that is similar to digging, and that is going to be a problem. And the Gemara says, is it? When it comes to the basin with a rim, what's going to be the problem over there? We've got a Mishnah. If you have buried a turnip or radish in the ground beneath a vine, bisman, and turning the page now to 77b, bisman shamiktsas alav megulin eino choshesh. If part of the turnip or part of the radish is visible, then you are allowed to. There's no concern about being able to move it out. Sorry, if some of the leaves, I apologize, are visible, then and that's not what it's saying. It's saying that there's no concern of kilayim. Oh gosh, I can't read. Fine, very good. So let's say that one again. So we've got a Mishnah that says as follows: if you have buried a turnip or a radish under a grapevine, then if the leaves are visible inside the earth, there's not going to be a concern about kilayim. V'lo mishum ma'aseh. There's not going to be a concern about ma'aseh, about the tides. V'lo mishum shvius. And there's not going to be a concern about shvius. We don't have to get necessarily into what those three things are talking about. But the point that we need is v'nitalim b'Shabbos. You'll be allowed to move them on Shabbos. So that's the proof that we're bringing. We've got vegetables which are buried in the ground. They're visible in above the ground level, and you're allowed to move them on Shabbos. And what we're trying to say is this basket which is overturned, which is fixed to the ground, which has a rim inside the earth, which when you move it is going to move the earth. We're trying to say that shouldn't be okay, but we've got a Mishnah that says that it should. It says the Mishnah, Lo sricha deboi mora v'chatzina. The difference is, the Gemara answers, that you're going to require tools to be able to remove the basket, and that's going to be the problem over here. It's so fixed in place that you're going to need things to help you remove it, and that is going to be a problem, and that is why it's considered fixed. And if it's considered fixed, then it's going to be halachically able to reduce the height of your wall, and if that then makes it within acceptable height, you can use it as a space on Shabbos to be able to go up and down and to be able to eat the food on top. Continues the Gemara, Sulam hamitzri eino memayit v'hatsuri memayit. Two different types of ladders. An Egyptian ladder, if you were to place an Egyptian ladder against the wall, that's not going to diminish the height of the wall. But if you are using a Tyrian ladder, then that is going to diminish the height of your wall. Let's try and figure out what this is talking about. Hey chidami solam hamitzri. What is this case of an Egyptian ladder? Amri devei Rabbi Yanai. The Academy of Rabbi Yanai says, Kol she'ein lo arba chavukim. An Egyptian ladder is a ladder that doesn't have 4 rungs. So I guess it's like just a bit of a step ladder. Amalei Rav Acha berei de Rav Ravashi. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Ravashi, "My time at the sulam hamitzri delomimai." What is the reason that an Egyptian ladder is not going to diminish the height of the wall? Amalei, he said back to him, Lo shmi'alach hada amar Rav Acha bar Ada amar Rav Hamnuna amar Rav. Have you not heard what Rav Acha, the son of Ada, said, quoting Rav Hamnuna, said, quoting Rav? Did you not hear what Rav said? Mishum dahava le davar shenital b'Shabbos. That Rav said to us that the ladder, the Egyptian ladder, is something that can be moved on Shabbos. I have a kol davar shenital b'Shabbos, and anything that can be moved around on Shabbos is not going to diminish the height of the wall. So he asks, well, ihachi afilu surinami. If that's the case, then even a Tyrian ladder shouldn't diminish the height of the wall, because that can also be moved around and handled on Shabbos. So he answers, Hasan kuvda kover. Because a Tyrian ladder is so heavy, it's going to be considered as if it is permanently fixed to the ground. So there we're seeing that even something that can be moved, but it's so heavy, so it's not a case of necessarily that it has to be fixed to the ground. But even if something is extremely heavy, and it might be that it's not going to be easily moved on Shabbos, then, according to this opinion, it is going to be considered to be halachically fixed, and that would help diminish the distance between the floor space and the top of the wall. Amar Abaye, Kosel shebein shtei chatzeros, if you have a wall separating two courtyards, Gavoha asara tefachim, and the height of the wall is 10 tefachim. V'hiniach sulam rachav arba mikan, v'sulam rachav arba mikan. And you now put two ladders on either side of the wall. And the surface of the rung, let's say, the surface space of the rungs are 4 tefachim, which is going to create an implication of the dimensions that we need for it to be considered a separate space. Okay, so we've got a wall, we've got 10 tefachim high. We are now potentially reducing the height of the wall by these two ladders. But what's interesting over here is that there's one ladder on one side of the wall, and there's another ladder on the other side of the wall. Ve'ein bein zeh lazeh shlosha tefachim. And if you were to take away the wall, you would realize that these two ladders have been placed within 3 tefachim of each other. So even though there's a wall separating them, they're very, very closely aligned either side of the wall. So the Gemara is going to tell us, Memait, it's going to diminish the height of the wall. What I think that's trying to tell us is that it is going to help you to transfer between the two courtyards, because you now have a way up and you have a way down. You're creating a legitimate passageway between the two courtyards by having these two ladders set up side by side. You are now creating an ease of access between the two courtyards, and so you'll be able to create one Eruv between them. However, shlosha eino memai, but if these ladders are placed too far apart, then you're not going to be able to do that. V'lo amran ela de lo have kosel abar, but that's only going to apply if the floor space of the wall is less than 4 tefachim. But if the wall space, if the surface of the top of the wall is 4 tefachim, then even if you have even if the ladders are really far apart, so then you're still going to be able to create this passageway from one to the other, because you can go up on one side, utilize the whole space of that wall, and then come down the other side. But if it's not 4 tefachim, so then having these two ladders either side, having them in close proximity to each other, is enabling the flow of access over the wall, which means that the two courtyards can be combined for the sake of an Eruv and for the sake of free transfer between them. Amar Rabbevai bar Abaye, Rabbevai, the son of Abaye, said, Bana itztaba al gav itztaba. If you have a platform on top of a platform, so it's slightly different to a ladder. Im yesh be'itztaba hatachtona arba memayit. If the lower platform has the floor space of 4 by 4 tefachim, then that's going to be considered. Am I in the right place? Yeah. Then that's going to have considered to have diminished the space between the floor space and the height of the wall. Inami, alternatively, ein b'tachtona arba v'yesh be'elyona arba v'ein bein zeh lazeh shloisha memayit. Or if you have a platform which to get from the ground onto is going to be too high, but it's on top of another platform which you do then get the access to. So if the top one has a space of 4 by 4 and there's a gap smaller than 3 tefachim between the two different platforms, that's also going to work. So you must have this 4 by 4. You must be creating a floor space or a surface space that meets the required amount to be considered its own space. And so as long as you can access it in a way that fits the halachic parameters, it's going to reduce the size of your wall, which is going to mean that you can now utilize the top of the wall. Final point from our Gemara over here. V'amar Rab Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avuha Sulam she'shlivusov porchos. If you have a ladder where the rungs are flying, where they're disconnected, right? So we have a ladder where the rungs are disconnected. Im yesh b'shliva hatachtona arba mimayim. If the lowest rung it has 4 tefachim, then it's accessible from the ground. It meets the threshold of 4x4, and so it's going to reduce the height of the wall. Inami ein b'shliva hatachtona arba. The lower rung might be smaller than 4x4, but the yesh b'shliva halyona arba. But the next rung up, the upper rung, is going to be 4x4. Ve'ein bein zeh lazeh shlosha, and the distance between these two rungs is smaller than 3 tefachim. Then the Gemara tells us mimayit. Then it is going to reduce the height of the wall. I think what we learn from here is that this is all very, very difficult, but hopefully it has been made somewhat understandable, and that's where we leave it for today. So I thank everybody for joining. You can stick around on Zoom for the questions, but we're going to turn the recording off for now. I wish you all a wonderful and meaningful week, and we'll see you again, hopefully with glasses. Maybe I'll be able to see you. Take care, everyone.